Beneath your feet, deeper than the deepest cavern, past the mantle of stone and fire, there lies the restless heart of Earth. A core of molten iron and nickel spinning like a hidden sun, unseen yet felt in every gust of wind, every wave upon the shore, every breath drawn beneath the fragile shield of atmosphere. For it is this hidden rotation that generates the magnetic field, guarding life from the deadly fury of the stars, and though humanity rarely gives thought to the ground below, it is the heartbeat that has always been there, pulsing in silence, holding chaos at bay. And yet imagine for a moment the silence of that heartbeat suddenly falling still. No roar of iron currents, no invisible shield fending off solar winds, no compass needle aligning north, only the disquieting truth that the very engine of existence had stopped. What would you feel if the earth betrayed you? If the familiar sky above no longer belonged to you? If auroras of blood and emerald blazed across equators, painting deserts with lights meant only for polar skies? If satellites you depended upon fell mute and powerless, tumbling through poisoned air as fragments of once proud machines? Already, ancient myths echo in the silence, stories whispered by civilizations long gone, of a world that could fall into ruin when its core ceased to turn, and in this imagined moment you stand as witness, sensing the air grow heavier, the sky more hostile, the pull of gravity still steady yet strange, as if the ground trembled not from earthquake, but from a deeper unrest, as if the earth itself knew its soul was faltering. For this core is not mere metal but the axis of balance, the spinning crown that defines day and night, storm and calm, summer and winter, and to think of its ceasing is to think of a heart surrendering to silence, of breath caught forever between inhale and exhale, of a body collapsing under its own stillness. And though science may describe the physics, numbers and fields, here, in the imagined hush, it feels more like prophecy fulfilled, as though the ancients who carved spirals in stone and marked the heavens with omens knew that the end would not come from fire above but silence below, a silence that strips away the illusions of permanence, reminding you that every dawn, every compass, every storm held back by unseen power was a gift from a churning heart you never saw, and in the quiet between pulses you feel the awe, the terror, the reverence for the heartbeat of the planet that was never meant to stop, and yet, tonight, you imagine it has. At first it was nothing more than a whisper in the data, a flicker in the field so slight that only the most vigilant of scientists noticed, a compass needle trembling when no wind stirred, a satellite drifting a fraction off its predicted path, a glow of aurora seen not only at the poles but washing across unfamiliar skies where farmers stared upward in awe and unease, for the heavens were alive with colours meant only for northern nights, and though most dismissed it as a quirk of nature, those who listened closely to the earth felt an uneasiness rising, like the moment before a storm when the air grows heavy and still, a sense that the shield protecting us all was faltering, the invisible armour forged by the spinning core losing its strength, letting fragments of the sun's rage slip through, frying delicate circuits on orbiting machines, confusing pilots whose compasses spun lazily without pointing true, and in those moments of flicker the illusion of permanence cracked, for the world that had always seemed so steady revealed itself as fragile, reliant on a secret engine no eye had seen. And though humanity has long been enthralled by the sky, building myths of gods, dragons, and rivers of light, here was a truth both scientific and poetic, that every aurora was not only a dance of beauty, but also a scar of battle, a clash between Earth's magnetic shield and the relentless breath of the sun, and when the shield flickers, even briefly, the cosmos finds its way in, bringing radiation invisible yet deadly, disrupting signals that knit the globe together, whispering chaos into the order of everyday life. And while the first days of anomalies were met with wonder as crowds filmed glowing skies and posted them with joy, The undercurrent of fear grew. The scientists warned that such flickers were not harmless curiosities but symptoms of something greater. Like the faltering heartbeat of a giant, each skipped beat carrying the weight of impending collapse, and as days stretched into weeks, the flickers became more pronounced, longer, more unpredictable, until entire regions lost communication. Flights were rerouted in confusion, and whispers turned to shouts, as even those who never looked at a compass now felt the instability, the creeping realization that the Earth's core was slowing, unseen but undeniable, like a god withdrawing its hand from a world it once protected, leaving humanity to face the storm alone. And in that moment of flicker, where awe and dread mingled, the question lingered. Was this the beginning of the end, or merely the warning tremors before the true silence to come? The flickers that once appeared as curiosities soon revealed themselves as omens, for the magnetic field, that unseen guardian stretching far beyond the atmosphere, was thinning like worn fabric, and though to the naked eye the Earth seemed unchanged, beneath the shimmering auroras a war was being lost, the failing shield no longer strong enough to block the full force of solar winds, so streams of charged particles now pierced deeper into the atmosphere, disrupting radios, shorting power grids, and painting skies over cities with ghostly curtains of colour that glowed not as symbols of wonder but of warning, and humanity began to sense that the planet itself was growing vulnerable, its defences fading, leaving every life beneath the sky exposed to radiation that had always been kept at bay. And as the days unfolded, scientists released grave reports, explaining in words that governments struggled to soften, that the inner core's rotation had slowed, weakening the dynamo effect that once generated the magnetic field, that invisible shield that made life possible on Earth, and suddenly the connection was clear. If the core's heartbeat faltered, then the armour cracked, and without armour, the world was left naked before the sun's unrelenting fire, and people began to notice subtle yet terrifying signs. The buzzing in radios that no technician could fix, planes turning back mid-flight as their instruments went blind, satellites flickering in and out of contact, and farmers watching crops wilt as unusual radiation altered weather and soil. And though leaders stood before cameras assuring stability, their eyes betrayed fear, for even they could not ignore the sight of auroras cascading above deserts and jungles, places where such light had never been seen, nor the silence of satellites falling like stones into the ocean, nor the sudden failures of electrical grids plunging millions into darkness. A darkness heavy not only with absence of light but with the knowledge that the failing shield was more than a scientific curiosity. It was the unravelling of the delicate balance that allowed oceans to flow, winds to circle, and humanity to thrive. And whispers grew louder of ancient myths speaking of sky fires and poisoned air, of civilizations that vanished when the Earth's heart faltered. And though skeptics laughed in the early days, no laughter remained when compasses pointed nowhere, when auroras crowned every horizon, when even the most hardened deniers felt the unease of standing beneath a sky that no longer promised protection, but instead hinted at exposure. And as radiation quietly seeped deeper, invisible yet deadly, it became clear to all. The shield was failing, and with it the illusion of permanence was breaking, leaving the question not of if catastrophe would come, but when. They began to fall silently, at first a few small satellites blinking out without warning, their signals cutting off mid-transmission like voices swallowed in static. But soon the failures multiplied, entire constellations of orbiting machines shutting down as radiation-pierced circuitry designed only for a shielded world. And the skies that had once been filled with reliable guardians of communication, navigation, and surveillance now became graveyards of drifting wreckage, tumbling slowly until gravity pulled them downward, burning in streaks of fire across the night, each one a scar in the sky, and a reminder that the failing core was not an abstract theory, but a lived catastrophe. For humanity had built its civilization on these unseen sentinels, from the maps in your phones to the weather forecasts that guided crops, from the planes tracing invisible paths overhead to the voices carried across oceans in less than a breath. And without satellites, those threads snapped, leaving nations blind, disconnected, and adrift in a silence more profound than any blackout. For it was the silence of the skies themselves turning against us, and in the cities people gathered to watch as streaks of burning metal crossed the heavens, some mistaking them for meteors, others whispering of omens, yet all sensing that this was not the fall of chance but of order itself, the collapse of a delicate web that bound continents together, and pilots in cockpits struggled as navigation systems blinked off, reverting to instinct and old charts, while ships at sea found themselves drifting in confusion, their compasses already useless from the weakening magnetic field, their satellite guidance gone, their crews staring at stars with the desperation of ancient sailors, and governments scrambled to rebuild ground-based communication, but their efforts felt like patching leaks in a sinking ship, for the radiation storms kept coming, invisible tides sweeping through the upper atmosphere, frying circuits faster than they could be replaced, and with every silent fall the skies grew emptier, more hostile, less like a domain of human achievement and more like a wilderness reclaiming its own. And the people, who once trusted in the steady presence of satellites circling above, began to feel abandoned, cut off from the world, unable to know what storm approached, what conflict brewed, or what day it even was. And in that silence, fear blossomed. For if the skies could not be trusted, if the voices could no longer reach across distance, then civilization itself, fragile as glass, could shatter at any moment. And the truth hung heavy in every burning streak. The satellites were falling, the skies were no longer safe, and the failing core was not slowing its assault. It was only beginning. If the mysteries of Earth's hidden core fascinate you, and you want more journeys into the unknown, where science, history, and imagination collide, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Discover the secrets of the universe, the hidden forces that shape our world, and the questions that science dares to ask. Don't miss what comes next. Join us, and keep exploring the mysteries that lie beneath and beyond. On the ground, the silence of falling satellites gave way to something more insidious, a chaos that crept into daily life as compasses, those ancient tools that had guided humanity through forests, oceans, and skies for centuries, began to spin without meaning, their needles drifting in lazy circles or jerking toward directions that no longer existed, and with their failure came disorientation, on a scale the world had never known. For while digital maps and satellites had fallen, people still trusted the compass as a final anchor of direction, a steady truth pointing north. Yet now even that truth dissolved, leaving pilots lost above cloud cover, ships drifting in dark seas, hikers vanishing into wilderness, and soldiers stumbling blind across deserts. And though some clung to the stars, clouds of radiation storms veiled the heavens, while others turned to memory and instinct. But instinct faltered when rivers ran unfamiliar, and landmarks were swallowed in shifting weather, so that every journey became a gamble, every road uncertain, and humanity found itself unmoored, like a child suddenly abandoned by a parent's guiding hand. And the sense of betrayal ran deeper than inconvenience, for the compass was not just a tool, but a symbol of trust in the Earth's invisible order. And now that trust had been broken, replaced by suspicion and fear, with maps becoming relics of a world that no longer existed, their lines leading nowhere, their bearings useless. And in the cities, this chaos translated into grounded planes, derailed trains, and misrouted caravans of aid that never reached starving villages, while in rural lands, farmers stared at skies, unable to predict where storms would move, unable to time their planting, as if the earth itself had turned hostile, withdrawing the silent agreements that had long bound people to its rhythms, and whispers spread of an age returning, when humans lived not by machines or instruments, but by intuition. Yet even intuition failed when the very magnetism of the planet dissolved, when the North Star's guidance was drowned by unnatural light, and the ancient promise of direction faded. And in this disorientation, crime grew, borders blurred, armies misstepped, and the fragile cooperation that once linked nations began to dissolve. For what use was diplomacy when no one could guarantee arrival? What value was trade when no ship could find its harbour? And in this compass of chaos, the Corps' silence spoke louder than any voice, reminding all that direction itself. The simple concept of knowing where you stand in relation to the world was not guaranteed but a fragile gift of the spinning heart beneath their feet, a gift now slipping away. The seas, once steady in their ancient rhythm, began to shift with a will of their own, as if rebelling against the silence of the core. Tides no longer predictable but rising in surges that swallowed coastlines, and then retreating in eerie stillness, leaving ships stranded upon wet sand where no beach had existed the day before, and the balance of currents that had guided migration, carried warmth, and stabilized climates faltered, unravelling like a tapestry pulled loose thread by thread. For without the steady spin of Earth's inner dynamo, the oceans no longer obeyed the invisible laws that once held them in graceful motion, and sailors felt it first, tossed by currents that swirled without reason, pushed into storms that formed where calm waters had rested, their compasses already dead, and their maps made useless by seas that no longer followed charts. While along the shores, communities endured waves that rose with no moon to call them, crashing upon homes and fields, dragging away markets and families in the sudden roar of saltwater fury. And though in past centuries the sea had always been both danger and giver, now it became a true adversary, unbound by order, a restless giant unleashed, suffocating coral reefs with stagnant pools where currents failed to flow, starving fish that once thrived on circulation, and in turn starving the people who depended on them, and the skies grew heavy with moisture as evaporation surged in strange places, deserts briefly greening only to rot in floods, while fertile valleys drowned beneath storms carried by rogue ocean winds, and the ancient cycle of El Niño and La Niña, once predictable enough to forecast, vanished into confusion, leaving farmers staring at ruined crops, their fields drowned in rains that never ended or cracked by droughts where water had vanished, and the great conveyor belt of the deep ocean, that hidden river carrying heat from equator to pole, began to slow, falter, and break apart, tilting climates so that Europe shivered in sudden winters, while equatorial nations baked in heat that killed crops and cattle alike, and everywhere people felt betrayed. For the sea they had trusted as eternal foundation was now a shifting, raging entity, an enemy that swallowed coastlines, erased islands, and drowned memories, while myths returned in whispers of great floods foretold, of waters rising as punishment when the earth's heart grew weak, and those satellites once might have warned of storms, now the skies above were silent, and humanity stood unprepared, blind, watching as the oceans rebelled, as the tides no longer answered to moon or wind, but only to the silence of the spinning core that had held them in check, and the rebellion of the seas was only the beginning. The rebellion of the oceans summoned their counterpart in the sky, for when currents lost their rhythm, the winds that rode upon them also broke free of their ancient patterns, and what humanity once called weather became something far crueler. Winds without mercy sweeping across continents with no logic, no map, no cycle, tearing down cities where calm breezes had once carried laughter, while deserts birthed tempests that raged for weeks, burying villages beneath shifting dunes, and fertile plains were scoured by cyclones that spun without warning, ripping roofs from homes and hurling them into rivers already swollen with the ocean's unrest. And the jet stream, that once stable highway of air-guiding storms, fractured and fell apart, meandering like a drunken serpent across the globe, dragging winter into summer fields and summer heat into frozen valleys, leaving farmers broken by seasons that no longer kept their promises, while the winds themselves seemed alive, howling through mountain passes with voices like lamentations, roaring across coast to strip forests bare. And in every corner of the world people felt the breath of a planet undone, a breath no longer gentle but violent, as though the earth exhaled centuries of restrained fury now that its inner heart had grown still, and though meteorologists tried to forecast, their models collapsed under chaos, predictions worthless in a world where hurricanes spun out of calm skies and tornadoes touched down in lands that had never known them, and the people, stripped of satellites and compasses, could only wait and watch as skies darkened without reason, as winds howled with such force they uprooted monuments of stone, toppling towers once thought eternal, and whispers returned of forgotten gods, wind spirits and ancient punishments, of a world where storms once ruled and might rule again, and though some sought shelter underground, even there the winds reached, tearing through weakened infrastructure, driving fear into every trembling wall, while survivors staggered from ruined homes to see skies red with dust, green with lightning, black with cloud, and all realized the same truth. The balance had been broken, the tether cut, and the winds were no longer servants of climate but masters of destruction, unanswerable to any human will, a force without centre, without mercy, carrying not only the weight of air but the weight of despair. And in that despair humanity learned that the silence of the earth's core did not only betray the seas, it betrayed the skies, setting loose a chaos that no prayer, no machine, no science could hold back, and the winds, once songs of freedom, had become the scream of a dying planet. The chaos of the winds bled into the rhythm of the year, until even the ancient pulse of spring, summer, autumn, and winter dissolved into confusion, and the silence of seasons fell like a shroud over the earth, a silence not of peace, but of broken cycles, where blossoms opened in the dead of frost only to wither under sudden heat, where fields once golden with harvest froze beneath snow that should never have come, where children who once counted days to summer found themselves trapped in storms of ice, and elders who trusted the slow wheel of time wept to see it collapse. For the tilt of earth still leaned as it always had, but without the spinning core to steady it, the planet wobbled in subtle yet devastating ways, shifting climates without warning, dragging winter into lands unprepared and heat into fragile ecosystems, and farmers whose ancestors had planted by moon and season now stood bewildered, for no almanac could guide them, no inherited wisdom could explain a winter that burned, or a summer that froze, and communities fractured as food withered in fields. Livestock perished from exposure, and water vanished or drowned villages overnight. And in the cities, the silence of seasons took a subtler form. The disappearance of festivals timed to solstice, the confusion of calendars that no longer matched reality, the collapse of industries dependent on predictable climate, until the very measure of time seemed unmoored, and people whispered that perhaps the Earth's heartbeat had been the keeper of time all along, and now that it was failing, the wheel of the year spun wild, its spokes breaking, its path uncertain, and children born in this silence knew not the comfort of expected rains or the joy of awaited blooms, but only the dread of skies that betrayed them, and myths stirred once more, of gods who punished humankind by stealing away the seasons, forcing endless famine or endless storm. And as the silence deepened, it was not only crops that died, but traditions, stories tied to harvest and thaw, rituals of renewal and rest, all eroded by the uncertainty of a world without rhythm, and families huddled together, whispering not of next year but only of tomorrow, unsure whether tomorrow would bring fire or frost, storm or drought. And in that silence humanity felt smaller than ever before, fragile before the weight of a universe that had withdrawn its order, abandoned its covenant, leaving the earth not only vulnerable but unmoored in time, and the question lingered, heavy as winter's night. Without the seasons, what meaning does survival hold? It began as a strange shimmer, a ripple across the heavens so bright it blinded those who dared to look, and then the fire in the sky revealed itself, not the gentle auroras that once painted polar nights with mystery, but violent curtains of scarlet and gold tearing across the entire world, searing through the atmosphere as solar flares reached the ground unchecked, their invisible radiation no longer stopped by the fading shield of the magnetic field, striking satellites that still clung to orbit, frying whatever fragile circuits remained, and then piercing deeper into the cities below, crippling power plants, burning transformers, and igniting fires in neighborhoods where sparks leapt from wires and consumed entire blocks, while in rural fields, crops blackened under invisible rays, animals collapsed in confusion, and farmers could do nothing but watch as the very sky betrayed them. For what had once been a canopy of stars and dreams now became a weapon, hurling down storms of light and heat, and children cried as the heavens glowed red at midnight, mothers clutching them close as the air itself seemed alive with static, every radio filled with shrieks of interference, every screen blank or flickering with strange jagged lines, and scientists, their voices strained and exhausted, tried to warn that this was only the beginning, that each flare from the sun now struck Earth without mercy, each wave of radiation altering the chemistry of the skies, thinning the ozone, stirring wildfires in forests already dry from broken seasons, and pilots who once trusted their wings abandoned the skies, grounded by fear of storms they could not see but knew could kill them mid-air. And the oceans reflected these flames, waters shimmering with unnatural light as fish washed ashore by the thousands, poisoned not by pollution, but by exposure to forces once filtered, away, and the myths of fire from heaven became real once more. Stories of divine wrath whispered in hushed tones by survivors staring upward at glowing nights that never turned to dark, for day and night blurred together beneath this storm of solar fury, and in temples and homes people lit candles not in devotion but in desperation, praying for the return of silence, of stars, of balance, yet knowing in their bones that the heart of the planet, the spinning core that had been their shield for all of history, lay silent, and that silence was calling forth fire from the sky, a fire that would not cease, a fire that could strip away the last illusions of safety and reveal humanity for what it truly was. Fragile creatures beneath a cosmos of infinite, merciless power. Civilization had always been bound together by threads so delicate most never saw them. A fragile web of electricity humming through wires, signals leaping invisibly between towers, data coursing across oceans, food and medicine travelling along roads and rails timed to perfection. Yet when the fire in the sky tore through those threads, the fragility was exposed, and what once seemed like an unshakable network revealed itself as a house of glass trembling under a storm. For power grids that fueled entire nations faltered in cascades, each transformer sparking into flame as radiation crippled its circuits, plunging cities into darkness, not for an hour or a night, but for endless stretches where silence replaced the hum of machines and hospitals lost their lights, their patients gasping as ventilators ceased, while water treatment plants shut down and taps ran dry, leaving families clutching empty buckets in once modern neighbourhoods, and in markets the shelves grew bare, for supply chains snapped when trucks stalled without fuel, and ships wandered lost without navigation, and hunger, that old enemy thought banished by progress, returned with merciless speed, spreading through households that had never known famine, while disease followed close behind, flourishing in streets now unlit, unclean, unguarded, and the fragile web of trust that bound communities together frayed as neighbours turned wary of one another, hoarding food, guarding wells, whispering of betrayal, while governments, already crippled by silence from the skies, struggled to hold control, their speeches drowned by riots, and their orders ignored by people too hungry, too afraid, too angry to obey. And yet, even in the ruins of the network, a strange awareness grew, an understanding that humanity had mistaken convenience for permanence, mistaking a fragile web for an eternal foundation. And now, stripped bare, people began to see how thin the line between order and collapse had always been, how much of life depended on invisible currents born from a spinning core beneath their feet, currents that now lay dormant, silent, leaving civilization exposed to the chaos above and the unravelling below. And in that silence, as candles flickered in dark apartments, as mothers told stories to keep children from crying in the black nights, the question echoed not in laboratories or governments, but in the hearts of ordinary people. Could the web ever be rebuilt, or had the silence of the core unspun it forever, leaving only fragments drifting like torn silk in a storm that cared nothing for human dreams? Darkness became more than the absence of light. It became a presence in itself, thick and heavy, wrapping around streets where lamps no longer burned and filling valleys where the skies glowed red but gave no warmth, and humanity felt the descent into shadow, not only with their eyes but in their hearts. For as the fragile web collapsed, myths long buried stirred awake, whispered in hushed tones around fires or carved anew on crumbling walls. Tales of ancient prophecies that spoke of a time when the world's heart would fall silent and the skies would rain fire, when oceans would rise without mercy and the winds would scream without pause, and people began to believe these were not just stories but warnings left by those who came before. Forgotten civilizations that may have lived through the same unravelling, leaving behind fragments of their despair in symbols, ruins, and legends. And as fear deepened, belief took root, with some gathering in temples and abandoned churches to pray for forgiveness, others seeking prophets who claimed to hear the voice of the earth in its silence, and still others turning to violence, convinced that sacrifice or conquest might appease forces too vast to name. And the shadow was not only outside but inside, as trust fractured, families divided, neighbours accused one another of drawing misfortune. And in this climate of fear, leaders grew desperate, invoking myth themselves when science failed to bring comfort, their speeches laced with echoes of prophecy, their promises tainted with desperation. Yet the people sensed their words were hollow, for what god or government could shield them when the very planet's heart lay still, and the star above, once points of hope, now felt like eyes watching coldly as humanity stumbled in the dark. And it was here, in this descent, that a new kind of order began to rise, not from rationality or science, but from shadow itself, from the embrace of old fears reborn as faith, from the pull of symbols carved into stone long before history began, symbols of spirals, broken circles, and dying suns. And the descent into shadow was not merely an external collapse, but a return to something primal, a reminder that humanity, for all its machines and towers, remained bound to myth as tightly as to science. And when the ground beneath trembled not with quakes, but with silence, that myth became reality, leading them further into the unknown, where shadows ruled and the future was nothing but a question. In the ruins of universities and laboratories where silence now reigned, a few figures still laboured beneath, flickering lights powered by scavenged generators, the last scientists clinging to reason, while the world around them surrendered to myth, their hands stained with grease and ash as they scribbled equations on torn scraps of paper, their voices hoarse from endless debates over whether the dying core could somehow be revived. And though governments had fractured and institutions had crumbled, these men and women refused to abandon the pursuit of knowledge, for they believed that in the silence of the Earth's heart there must still be an answer, a key hidden in physics, in magnetism, in the churning flows of iron that once spun like a living sun beneath their feet. and their desperation was human, born not only from duty but from love, for their children who still cried in the dark, for the families waiting outside the laboratory doors, for the chance to restore not just balance but hope. And yet their work was haunted by fear. For instruments once trusted gave erratic readings, their sensors fried by storms of radiation, their computers sputtering with every surge, forcing them to return to hand-drawn charts and memory, and still they pressed on, mapping anomalies, charting the drift of auroras, studying ancient cores of stone that carried echoes of Earth's magnetic past, believing that perhaps history had seen such collapses before, and maybe survival had been possible. But even as they worked, their numbers dwindled. Some lost to raids by desperate mobs who saw science as sorcery, others claimed by sickness from radiation or starvation, until the survivors were only a handful scattered across bunkers, caves and hidden rooms, connected not by satellites or radio but by couriers risking storms to carry messages scratched in ink. And those messages were fragile lifelines, fragments of equations, warnings, desperate pleas for collaboration, as if the fate of the world rested in scraps of paper and the stubborn hope of a few minds unwilling to let go. And outside their sanctuaries the world descended deeper into superstition. But inside, the last scientists whispered of possibility, of colossal machines that might mimic the dynamo effect, of detonations deep within the mantle that might stir the iron once more, of alliances between knowledge and myth, if they could only convince the frightened masses that salvation might lie not in prayer alone, but in understanding. And though doubt gnawed at them, though exhaustion pulled at their bones, they continued, for to surrender would be to let the silence win, and so they laboured on, fragile and determined, guardians of reason, at the edge of a world collapsing into shadow. In the midst of the world's unravelling, when the last scientists fought to keep reason alive, others began to dig not into equations but into memory, searching ruins, scriptures and fragments of forgotten lore. For in the pulse of memory there might be answers older than science itself, truths buried in stone and myth that hinted at times when the Earth's core had faltered before, and archaeologists who once studied in quiet museums now roamed shattered landscapes, clutching tablets etched with spirals, fragments of murals showing skies burning with fire, oceans rising and figures pointing to stars, symbols that mirrored the present collapse with uncanny precision. And though many dismissed these findings as superstition, the patterns could not be ignored. For why would civilizations thousands of years apart carve the same warnings, speak of a heartbeat deep within the earth, describe flames falling from heaven, unless they too had lived through it? And as this pulse of memory grew stronger, storytellers and elders carried the fragments into communities, whispering of civilizations that had vanished not from war or plague, but from the silence of the earth's heart. And within these stories some saw hope, believing that if others had faced it and left warnings, then perhaps survival was possible, while others sank deeper into despair, seeing only proof that humanity was doomed to repeat cycles of collapse. And yet there was something undeniably human in the way people clung to these echoes of the past, gathering in broken temples where carvings of dying suns were illuminated by firelight, or passing down prophecies once mocked as myth, but now heard with reverence. And the scientists too, weary and desperate, began to listen, weaving fragments of memory into their equations, noting that even myths spoke of shifts in seasons, wandering stars, floods and storms, all signs of a failing magnetic field. And in this strange union of myth and reason, a fragile possibility emerged. That memory itself carried a map, a guide through the storm, if only it could be deciphered. And so the pulse of memory became more than nostalgia. It became a rhythm, a heartbeat of human resilience echoing across centuries, reminding the living that they were not the first to face silence, that survival might be hidden, not only in machines but in stories, in symbols, in the stubborn refusal of memory to die. And as voices rose in song, recalling ancient chants thought long forgotten. It was as though humanity itself was reaching backward and forward at once, holding on to the past in order to carve a future, fragile yet still alive. The pulse of memory, instead of uniting humanity in a shared awareness of the past, became another fracture line, for as knowledge spread that ancient civilizations may have once endured the silence of the core, the world divided more sharply than ever, with some nations hoarding relics and scientific fragments as if possession of memory itself could guarantee survival, while others collapsed entirely, their people scattered like leaves in the storms, and out of this chaos rose factions, some devoted to reason, gathering around the last scientists who still worked feverishly in their hidden labs, others turning fully to prophecy and myth, raising leaders who claimed divine visions of how to endure the end, and still others descending into anarchy, choosing to take what they could while time remained, and borders that once defined nations dissolved as waves of displaced survivors crossed mountains and seas, fleeing regions where radiation burned fields, where storms never ceased, where oceans claimed coastlines, and with these migrations came conflict, as every camp, every settlement, every city fortress grew suspicious of strangers, fearing their hunger more than their stories, and alliances once forged in treaties collapsed in days, replaced by warlords and councils of survival who cared not for history, but only for control of dwindling food and fragile shelters. And yet even in this divided world there were whispers of cooperation, a recognition that no faction, no nation, no ideology could survive alone against the failing shield of the earth. But fear is louder than reason, and so mistrust reigned, and the few scientists who carried fragments of possible solutions found themselves hunted not for their answers, but for the hope others believed they represented, dragged into camps and temples, commanded to build miracles, while their own voices broke as they explained that no miracle was guaranteed, only struggle, only time, and meanwhile families starved in refugee columns stretching across ruined highways, mothers clutching children as winds whipped dust into their lungs, fathers staring at empty skies once filled with guiding satellites, and the dreams of unity faded into the reality of a fractured globe, where the silence of the core echoed not only through nature but through the human heart, exposing division, selfishness, desperation, yet also resilience. For scattered among the ruins were still those who offered bread to strangers, who lit fires for the lost, who remembered that even in division, humanity's survival depended on threads of compassion, as fragile yet as vital as the magnetic shield that once held the earth safe. And it was in these small acts, invisible against the scale of collapse, that the possibility of another path lingered, though dim, though uncertain, like a spark within endless night. The cities, once monuments of light and ambition, became graveyards smouldering beneath skies stained with smoke. Their towers toppled not only by storms and quakes, but by the silent betrayal of systems that no longer breathed. For when power grids failed and supply chains dissolved, hunger spread faster than fire, and where hunger walked, violence followed, leaving once thriving streets scattered with ash, and families who once lived in glass towers now huddled in ruins, building fires from shattered furniture, whispering in fear as gangs roamed the darkness in search of food, while the air itself grew poisonous, thick with soot from burning neighbourhoods, where desperation had driven people to torch their own homes in futile warmth, and rivers choked with debris carried the smell of rot downstream, turning once clean water into poison, while rats thrived where people starved, carrying sickness through alleys, their red eyes gleaming in the dim light of a world collapsing, and above it all the skies remained cruel, streaked with auroras no longer beautiful but ominous, their ghostly colours casting cities in eerie light, reminders that the failing core allowed radiation to pour unfiltered, that the fire in the heavens was not blessing but curse, and survivors whispered of the cities as if they were living corpses, giants reduced to ash, their bones still standing in broken bridges and skeletal skyscrapers. And yet within the ash were flickers of humanity. Children laughing briefly over scraps of food, old songs hummed by trembling lips in the dark, hands clasped in fleeting solidarity even as shadows pressed closer. And though scientists had once promised progress eternal, now even they wandered these ruins, haunted by the knowledge that their equations could not shield against the silence within the earth, and so the cities burned, not in sudden apocalypse but in slow decay, each day erasing another street, another block, another memory of what was, until maps became lies and names lost meaning, and travellers described them only as wastelands of smoke and cinders, where once mighty civilizations turned to powder beneath careless winds, and the world, divided and desperate, carried forward this new identity. Not builders of steel and glass, but wanderers among the cities of ash, carrying on their backs whatever fragments of the old world they could salvage, even as hope itself seemed to wither in the choking haze. The collapse of the cities left survivors wandering in search of stability, but what they found instead was a planet caught between contradictions so violent it seemed the earth itself had lost its mind, for the oceans began to freeze while the skies above them burned, a paradox born from the silence of the spinning core, where currents that once carried warmth from equator to pole had stopped, leaving vast stretches of sea locked in ice, their frozen surfaces stretching like endless mirrors under skies ablaze with radiation storms, and ships that dared the waters found themselves trapped in walls of ice that closed in overnight, their crews forced to abandon steel hulls for the bitter cold of drifting floes, while far from those frozen expanses deserts blistered under relentless heat, the air shimmering with waves of fire as solar flares pierced the weakened shield, igniting wildfires that spread like rivers of flame, consuming forests, fields, and entire villages, so that one hemisphere lived under silence of frost while another gasped in furnaces of light, and people caught between these extremes spoke of a world split in two, one side suffocated by ice, the other by fire, and the balance that had defined climate for millennia was gone, replaced by chaos that reshaped the very identity of nations, forcing migrations of millions who fled burning valleys only to meet seas frozen solid, stumbling into camps where hunger met cold and where the skies burned, crops withered in days, turning fertile soil to ash, while where the oceans froze, fishing fleets found their nets empty beneath silent, lifeless waters, and entire cultures built upon the sea dissolved, their traditions locked under sheets of ice, and the people whispered of omens, of an earth torn apart by its own silence, cursed to wander between extremes with no middle ground. And in those extremes the human spirit strained, some collapsing into despair, others adapting with desperate ingenuity, wrapping homes in layers of scavenged metal to survive the cold, digging shelters into scorched earth to hide from the burning skies. But all knew that survival was temporary, for the silence of the core was not finished, and as the oceans hardened and the heavens blazed, the question rose like a shadow over every campfire. If the seas and skies could betray so quickly, what next would the earth take from them, and how long before even the ground beneath gave way? The world that had once been filled with the clamour of life began to quiet, not in peace, but in absence. For after the oceans froze and the skies burned, a new stillness crept across the planet, a silence so profound it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. And this birth of silence was not the calm of dawn, but the suffocation of a heartbeat gone still, for species that had once filled forests with song vanished in waves, birds falling from the sky with wings too scorched or lungs too weak, fish floating belly up in seas turned stagnant under ice, insects no longer humming through meadows but lying lifeless in heaps, and without them the world lost its music, a symphony of existence reduced to the hollow echoes of wind across barren plains, and people felt the absence more than the storms themselves. Waking in nights so unnaturally still, they strained to hear even the croak of a frog or the rustle of a tree, yet finding nothing but the beating of their own anxious hearts, and in this silence, despair deepened. For humanity is a creature of rhythm, tied to the sounds of nature as surely as to its breath. And now that rhythm faltered, people began to feel the weight of extinction pressing down, their own voices sounding alien in a world that no longer answered back, and villages huddled together in fear, whispering that the earth's soul was dying, that the silence was not simply emptiness but a presence, vast and heavy, a shadow swallowing all that had been alive, and even the last scientists, hardened by reason, felt their resolve break as their instruments recorded silence in place of signals, as the pulse of magnetic fields dropped to nothing, leaving only flat lines on broken screens. And yet within this grief a strange reverence grew, a recognition that the silence was not merely death, but transformation, a threshold between what was and what might come, and though it filled lungs with dread, it also stirred an ancient instinct, the awareness that endings carry seeds of beginnings, that silence, though terrifying, can also be the cradle of change. And as the earth fell quiet, as humanity trembled within its hushed embrace, the question lingered in every heart. Was this silence a requiem, or was it the moment before the birth of something new? In the wake of the silence, when the skies had burned and the seas had frozen and life itself seemed to falter, humanity's last gamble emerged from the ruins. Colossal machines built to imitate the dynamo once hidden in the Earth's core, vast engines of fire and iron rising like mechanical mountains from wastelands, their smokestacks clawing at the heavens, their pistons pounding in mimicry of a heartbeat, and they were called the machine heart, a desperate attempt to conjure motion where nature had failed, to weave back the magnetic field with coils the size of towers, to forge an artificial shield against the storms of the sun. And though the engineers who birthed them were few, their eyes hollow from hunger and loss, they laboured with the fever of those who know there may be no tomorrow, welding fragments of cities into circuits, cannibalising relics of satellites into generators, turning temples of myth into workshops where sparks lit the dark. And when the machine heart first roared to life, its tremors shook the ground like the pulse of some titanic beast awakening, sending currents of energy screaming into the sky. And for a moment, hope flared as compasses twitched, as auroras dimmed, as the veil of radiation seemed to falter, and people knelt in awe, believing salvation had come at last. But the roar was unstable, the rhythm uneven, for no machine, no matter how vast, could truly replace the molten sun beneath the mantle, and soon cracks appeared. Coils overheated, towers collapsed under their own strain, and yet the survivors clung to the sound, to the pounding of pistons echoing across valleys. For even if it was imperfect, even if it devoured resources faster than they could provide, it was a heartbeat, artificial yet alive, and in its thunder they heard the echo of what the earth had once been, and some believed that if enough machine hearts were built, scattered across continents, they could awaken the planet itself, jumpstart the iron rivers that now lay still, while others feared that tampering with the earth's silence would only invite greater disaster, tearing open wounds too deep to heal. And so the machine heart became more than an invention. It became a symbol of defiance, of desperation, of humanity's refusal to surrender, even when the world itself had abandoned them. And whether it was a miracle or a monstrosity, its rhythm carried into the night, a reminder that though the earth's core had gone silent, humanity still sought to make it sing again. The machine heart thundered with uneven rhythm, a creation born of desperation rather than mastery, its pounding echoing across the broken valleys like a reminder that humanity still clawed at survival. Yet with every roar came the question that weighed heavier than the storms, heavier than the silence itself. Should it continue, or should it be silenced? For the choice had arrived. the choice between forcing the Earth to awaken with artificial fire or surrendering to adaptation in a world remade by chaos and factions gathered around this question with a fervour that rivaled faith, some insisting that only by reigniting the core, no matter the risk, could the planet be saved, arguing that the machine heart was not simply a tool, but a spark, a chance to rebuild the shield, to restore the balance of tides and winds, while others warned that tampering further could rupture the mantle, split continents, and end what fragile life still clung to existence. And caught in the middle were the survivors, families who had lost children to burning skies and frozen seas, people who no longer cared for theory but only for tomorrow, and yet even they could not escape the weight of the decision. For if the machine heart failed entirely, hope itself would die. But if it succeeded and backfired, Earth itself might be broken beyond recognition. And in this conflict leaders rose, not kings or scientists alone, but ordinary voices who carried the trust of their people, mothers who spoke of starving children, elders who remembered myths of rebirth, and young ones who had never seen a stable season, each voice adding to the debate until the choice was no longer about machines, but about identity, about whether humanity would cling to the world as it once was or accept the truth of what it had become. And the scientists, gaunt and weary, whispered of equations they could not complete, of probabilities that offered no guarantees, their honesty a cruel mercy, for it left the choice naked, unshielded by certainty. And so under skies stained red with auroras, in camps lit by fire rather than electricity, the world paused in its chaos to consider the question that could shape all futures, to push the machine heart to full strength and gamble on revival, or to turn away, abandon the dream of restoration, and instead learn to live in a planet of silence, storms, fire, and ice. And as the debate reached its crescendo, as fists pounded tables and tear-streaked faces, the Earth itself seemed to wait, its silence pressing close, as though listening for what its fragile children would choose. The night of decision came with a sky ablaze. Auroras stretched like torn banners across the heavens, their glow falling upon faces gathered around the trembling machine heart, its roar uneven, its fire spilling sparks into the dark, and humanity stood at the edge of its story, knowing that whatever choice was made would ripple through time as the final echo of this age, and the people who remained, scientists, wanderers, survivors of cities turned to ash, joined in one place, some with eyes full of hope, others with dread, while children clung to their parents, sensing the weight of history pressing down. And when the order was given, when the engines were fed their last reserves of fuel, the ground shook as though the earth itself stirred in answer, compasses twitching wildly, the air buzzing with static, lights flickering in places that had known only darkness for years. And for a fleeting heartbeat humanity felt triumph, believing the core itself might awaken, that the shield might return, that the world might be reborn. Yet even in that moment doubt gnawed, for the roar of the machine heart was not steady. It was not the eternal rhythm of molten iron flowing beneath the mantle, but the fragile beat of human hands imitating what only the earth had known how to create. And then came the silence, sudden and absolute, the machine heart choking, shuddering and collapsing inward, leaving nothing but smoke rising into the already scorched air, and the people froze, breathless, waiting for the sky to fall, yet the silence held, deep and oppressive, and it was then they understood the echo would not come from machines, not from governments, not from prophets, but from themselves, from the way they carried forward into a world forever changed, some whispering that the machine heart had failed, others insisting that its brief roar had awakened something deep within, a seed that might one day stir. And so the story ended not with fire or flood, but with an open question, for as dawn broke across a planet of ice and flame, of storms and silence, humanity still walked, fragile yet unbroken, carrying memory, myth, and determination into an uncertain horizon. And the echo that lingered was not of engines or of the Earth's lost core, but of voices promising to endure, to adapt, to survive, and perhaps, in that resilience, to begin again. And so, the question lingers: what if Earth's core truly stopped spinning, the heartbeat of our planet, silenced forever? Would we endure the storms, or vanish beneath cosmic fire? Tonight you have glimpsed a vision of a world undone by its own silence. But the story of Earth is not finished, and neither is your journey. If you seek more mysteries of science, of history, of the unseen forces shaping our world, stay with us. Let curiosity guide you, and let wonder keep you searching. The Earth turns still, but for how long?